So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rosanna Norman from GÉANT. I'm one of the organizers of the Cybersecurity Month campaign, Cyber Hero at Home. As you know, that Cybersecurity Month is an initiative launched by ENISA, which is the European Agency for Cybersecurity. And for those of you who are not familiar with GÉANT, just let me give you a quick introduction. GÉANT is the organization that delivers a worldwide network and services for research and education. We operate a pan-European infrastructure called the GÉANT network and run a membership association for Europe, National Research and Education Networks, NRENS, which is called the GÉANT Association. Cyber Hero at Home is a campaign for and from the GÉANT community, and its objective is to help users to operate in a digitally safe home working environment, to protect and defend their identity, their devices, their network, and also to be in general aware of cybersecurity and cybercrime. Every single one can be a cyber hero. This is the overall message of our campaigns. This is the week number 2 of the campaign, and it focuses on protect our networks. Today, we are very happy to present the second of our weekly webinars that take place throughout the month of October, every Thursday at 3 p.m. CEST. And it will be presented by Arnout Terpstra from SURF in the Netherlands with the title, Think Before You Click, Privacy in a Highly Technologized Society. So nowadays, it's nearly impossible to use products, websites, applications, even household appliances without giving up some of our privacy. The same applies to employees in research and education. So in order to be good citizens, do employees need to become, people need to become privacy experts? But what is privacy exactly? And obviously, why there is so much emphasis on it nowadays? Great, we need to listen to Arnout to find out. The webinar will last 1 hour, including 15 minutes of Q&A, and you can put your Q&A in the Q&A feature of this Zoom webinar. I hope you enjoy it, and you have plenty of questions for Arnout at the end. So happy listening, and over to you, Arnout.
All right, thank you very much, Rosanna. And thank you for the introduction as well. I'll quickly start because, of course, I have a lot of slides and a lot to tell. Just a brief additional introduction. I work for SURF as a product manager in the trust and identity team, but I'm also doing a PhD research 1 day a week. So I'm an external PhD student at the Tilburg University in the Netherlands. So I'm going to tell you today a couple of things, and I think Rosanna summarized it very well. All the topics that she mentioned will appear today. So first of all, I'll start with what's actually going on with online privacy today. I'll give a couple of examples why we should all worry about what's going on. Then I'm going to quickly and briefly discuss why privacy is so important in our society. And after that, what it exactly is, because the definition of privacy is quite vague. Then I have a couple of slides about how privacy is regulated, especially in the EU. You probably all know the GDPR. I'll summarize some of the basic concepts such that non-legal people can also understand it. And last but not least, I'll dive into my own research, how I think we can sort of close the gap between privacy experts and normal users a little bit. But this will all become clear in the end. So let's start with the first part. I still encounter people today who claim that they have nothing to hide, or that privacy is dead and that we should get over it. It should be no surprise to you that I disagree with that. So allow me to show you through a couple of examples what's happening right now when it comes to our privacy and why we should be worried. First of all, there's this thing called data breaches. It's actually one of the biggest problems for online privacy. And with data breaches, I actually refer to unintentional data leaks. So these are cases where huge databases of personal data are made available publicly by usually criminal hackers with bad intentions. And these criminals then use these stolen databases to extort the company they hacked and force them to pay a certain amount of money. And if they do not do so, they will release all the data on the public World Wide Web. And the visualization you see here on the left is shows some of the biggest known data breaches in the past couple of years. So there may be a lot more because these are only the ones that have been reported. And as you can see, if you add up all the numbers, data of hundreds and hundreds of millions of people has already been leaked worldwide. The example on top in the orange circle is one of the latest data breaches by Facebook. Over 500 million people their data was exposed, and the data included phone numbers, full names, locations, email addresses, and biographical information. And of course, security researchers say that hackers can use these data to impersonate people and commit fraud. There's another example on the right. This is a company called Cambridge Analytica. I think most of you will have heard of that. And this is a bit different because this was not actually a hack. This was not stolen data. This was intentional in the sense that Facebook provided this company called Cambridge Analytica with almost unlimited access to all their data through APIs. And what is also different about this is that the data was not used to extort companies or to sell to criminals, but to sell to political parties. So allegedly, Cambridge Analytica helped political parties influence some of the elections in some countries. So the point of this first slide would be our personal data that is stored everywhere nowadays is at the risk of falling in the hands of the wrong people with bad intentions. And these data can be used to commit fraud, to impersonate us, and to even manipulate our decisions. That's unfortunately not all, because not only criminals and political parties are interested in our personal data. Governments and intelligence agencies across the world, of course, are interested too, because they want to observe us. Who doesn't know the guy on the left? This is obviously Edward Snowden, who almost 10 years ago revealed that the National Security Agency in the US was massively collecting data all across the world about basically anyone for the purposes of national security and the war on terror. More recently, a company called Clearview AI came into attention because it is being used by police forces in some countries, also in the Netherlands. And they use facial recognition software to find people, basically. And they scrape the whole internet. So they just take publicly available photos of anyone, put it into their database, and use the algorithms to scan it. This is highly problematic because on the one hand, it's questionable whether these algorithms actually perform the way they do. So it is known that even the best facial recognition software has a lot of false positives and false negatives. So that means that people would be flagged as a suspect, even though they're not the person that they're looking for. And on the other hand, Clearview has to put the data of millions of people into their databases, even though the list of suspects they usually need to find is only a handful. So this is not very proportionate. And it's very likely that photos of you and me and everyone in this webinar are in their databases as well. So this is mass surveillance by governments and intelligence agency. But of course, that is not all as well. This is because the examples I just mentioned are usually about data that would otherwise be private. I mean, if you put something on your Facebook profile and even set it to completely private, you expect that it's not visible to the entire world. So it's not strange that you expect that other parties such as the government or intelligence agencies do not have access to it, maybe with a warrant, but in general not. But this, for some social networks, this is definitely not the case. And as human beings, we are very bad at overseeing the consequences of the data we share. And this is where this well, sort of funny website came in a couple of years ago. This website is called Please Rob Me, and it was built by a couple of students in the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken. And they intended to raise awareness about oversharing on social media, because this was in the time that an app called Foursquare was really popular. And this was an app where you could constantly check into locations such as, stores, restaurants, movie theaters. So you could post on your social media profile that you were at the movies, at the restaurant, all those things. And the consequence of this is that, of course, when you are at the movies or in a restaurant, you are not at home. And so this means you're not only sharing where you are, but also where you are not. And of course, the latter is very interesting to criminals who might want to break into your house. And of course, they'd rather do that when you're not at home. So this was a website, it's called Please Rob Me, and it listed all the publicly available data of people who were sharing that they were basically not at home. The goal was to generate a lot of attention. I guess they did. So they took the website down once it became really big because of, the risks of actually inspiring criminals to do this. The last thing I want to show in this first part is how we use seemingly harmless apps. Foursquare was an example of a seemingly harmless app which could actually be used for bad intentions, but this is another one. This is an app called Polar, and the Dutch news platform The Correspondent actually found out how this data that is seemingly harmless can be used against you. So Polar is an app to track your running routes, to keep you fit. So that is actually a very harmless and even maybe a good way to use an app. But what The Correspondent found out is that your running routes actually reveal a lot more information about you than you might initially think. So for instance, if you look at the right picture, the place where you constantly start and end your run is very likely the place where you live, right? And what they also found out, it's barely visible from the left picture, but if you run constantly, if you run around known military bases, it's highly likely that you work there. So what they did is that they combined these data, which was available through the app and also publicly, and they found out people in the Netherlands who worked for the military intelligence service. And they even went to one person's home and confronted this person with this information, which was very scary, because who works for the military intelligence service is normally considered highly classified information and even a state secret. And fairly easily, a couple of journalists were able to find out this information. So that is, of course, very scary. And of course, it was not intentional for Polar to reveal who works for the military, nor do they probably care. But they did make an app which makes it possible to find such information out. And I assume that they did not do this on purpose. And why would they make such an app that gathers so much personal data? Well, of course, they want to gather personal data about the users to sell to data brokers and advertisers to keep the app free to use. So the first 4 slides that I just showed you, the first part, I would like to conclude with, apparently our personal data has value. It has value to criminals because they can use our data to commit fraud and do identity theft, for instance, or steal big databases of personal data and then extort organizations for money. Our data has also value to governments because governments want to surveil on us, to spy on us, to allegedly catch criminals and terrorists. Last but not least, our data also has value to companies because they can use our personal data, our characteristics, to sell to advertisers. So we have a huge online privacy problem. The next question would then be, why should we care? Why is privacy important? And by the way, what is it exactly? So allow me to dive into a little bit of detail there. Let's start with why privacy is important. So this slide is actually a summary of many sources and books. So it is far from complete. but I picked out some of the most important aspects to discuss here. So the first point, I already said it, criminals can use your personal data to perform identity theft, which can then be used against us, of course, and this can lead to actual physical harm. For instance, loss of money. If a criminal sort of drains your whole bank account one way or the other, it will cost you money, which is a physical harm, but also psychological harm. And this is a very important point, because in courts, whenever you sue a criminal, for instance, and you want to be compensated for your loss, a psychological harm is very hard to translate to for instance, a certain amount of money. So the psychological harm would be, suppose that you have a credit card, and suppose that your credit card company has a data leak, but until now your data has not been misused. That doesn't mean that in the future somewhere it's possible that the criminal will still use your data. So the fear of your data being misused in the future would be an example of a psychological effect. Second, privacy is actually highly needed for us as human beings to be who we want to be. It is therefore considered often as a human right, similar to the freedom of speech. We need privacy to grow as a person, to develop ourselves, and to learn to take care of ourselves and, you know, make our own decisions. Because what happens when we know we are constantly being watched, we start to behave differently. So we will not be our full selves. And the example I included here is a pretty well-known example. It's called the panopticon from Jeremy Bentham. It's the image on the right. This is a concept where a prison, where a single prison guard, here located in the tower in the middle, is able to observe all the inmates. Of course, not at the same time. But since the inmates are unable to tell whether the prison guard is looking at them or someone else, they just assume that they are being watched all the time. And the assumption here is, of course, that they will then behave as good boys and girls. This is, of course, an extreme example from prison, but think about this for a second for yourself. If you know someone is watching along with literally everything you're doing online on your laptop or on your phone, would you still do everything you do right now? So this effect that you will start behaving differently is called chilling effects. Third, the reason why privacy is important is that privacy means power. If you know more about others than they know about you, you can use this data to your advantage. I included two examples here. Apparently, more and more companies start checking social media profiles of job applicants. And if they find something they don't like, they simply won't invite you. Second example is from a Dutch news website. It's about extortion online using nude photos, because young people, whether you like it or not, they sometimes send nude photos of themselves to supposedly other people. But sometimes the person on the other side is not who they claim to be, and they use this material to extort people into, again, paying a lot of money. Again, this is a physical harm because of the money that they lost, but also psychologically, this will be very damaging for a young person. So it's important to realize here that privacy has both an offline, a real world dimension, as well as an online dimension, as becomes really visible from the last example, for instance, because usually the sharing of such a photo happens online. But the effects of this photo, of this piece of data, are definitely feelable offline as well. So I guess, I hope I sort of convinced you a little bit why privacy is important. Now let's look at what privacy actually is. When it comes to defining privacy, the conclusion of literally decades of research is that it's almost, or maybe even completely, impossible to define. There is no single agreed upon definition. It simply means too many things at the same time, and its focus evolves over time. And this has been the case since the first conceptualization of privacy in 1890. So the definition of privacy evolves over time, which I will demonstrate shortly in this slide. but also within individuals, because as people grow older and they learn more, they grow as human beings, they will value privacy differently. This doesn't mean, however, that kids, young people, for instance, sending nude photos, do not care about privacy. Of course they do, but they do not yet realize what the consequences are, and for instance, what it means if you post something on Facebook publicly. But they do care about privacy, they just don't want their parents to find out. So it's a very different conceptualization of privacy, so to say. So the second reason why privacy definition changes is that it follows the technological developments that are happening in society. And this first example will demonstrate that. This is from 1890. When privacy was first conceptualized as the right to be let alone. And this conceptualization was not by accident, because it went hand in hand with new inventions in technology and business models, which taken together created a whole new generation of privacy problems. And those developments were first the portable photo camera, and second, celebrity journalism. So what happened was that suddenly people could afford a photo camera, and at the same time it was possible to make money with photos, for instance, of famous people, because of the gossip press. So what people were doing back then on a large scale was constantly harassing famous people and taking pictures of them. So the first time when this happened, people started realizing we need to define a right to privacy, and we need to, even famous people have the right to roam the streets without being harassed all the time. So this is where the right to be let alone came from. Now, fast forward to the 1990s, when the World Wide Web suddenly became very popular. The definition, the right to be let alone, no longer sufficed, because what happened in the 90s was that more and more people had a computer in their house, in their homes, which was connected to the World Wide Web. And with the click of a button, it was suddenly possible to share information with basically anyone across the world. And what it means, if the information that is sometimes about people could be copied to hundreds or even thousands of computers with a single click on the mouse, but this doesn't mean that people roaming the streets were actually harassed. So the previous definition of privacy no longer works. So what happened then is that people started conceptualizing privacy as control. So you as a data subject should have full control over the data that is about you. You decide with whom you want to share data, who is able to do what with it, why they should have it, etc. So the previous definition no longer sufficed. And what we know now, I'm going to fast forward again to today, is that this definition no longer suffices as well, because what you see is that there are simply way too many decisions to take if you want to have full control over your data. If you properly want to do this, you would have to read every privacy notice of every service that you are going to use, and you have to give your consent to it prior to using the service or the app. And of course, we know nobody reads those privacy policies. They're way too long, they're way too complicated, and it cannot be realistically expected of people to actually do this. So again, even this definition no longer suffices, even though sometimes we still see it. In a couple of slides, we will get to the definition that I think is very good and usable today. But before that, we have to dive a little bit deeper and look at the concept of what personal data actually is. Especially when it comes to online privacy, of course, there's always personal data involved. And there are actually 3 types of personal data. So the first one is the most obvious one, and this would be volunteered personal data. So if you sign up for Facebook or for the fitness app I just mentioned before, you will have to hand over some of your data in order to be able to use it, such as your name, your email address, maybe even your birth date. And in the case of the fitness app, you will have to hand over your GPS coordinates every 1 or 2 seconds. And this is something that you voluntarily give to Facebook or to Polar. But that's not all, because based on these voluntarily given data, you can also observe certain data, or the recipient can also observe certain data. So, for instance, what it means if you give your GPS coordinates away every 1 or 2 seconds is that Polar is able to observe your running route, because they know 2 seconds ago you were there and 2 seconds before that you were there. So they can really see how you move across the streets, even though that you did not voluntarily tell Polar, this is the street that I'm now currently in. They are able to observe this. And this is often called metadata or exhaust data by Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote the excellent book Surveillance Capitalism. And last but not least, this is where it really gets interesting, is that the recipient of the data is also can also infer certain new data based on the first 2 categories. I already said it in the beginning, if the place where you start running and end your run is the same all the time, then Polar is able to infer where your home address is, even though that you did not voluntarily share it with Polar. So what I wanted to say here is that both privacy and personal data are actually quite complex. But on the other hand, we do expect people, users, citizens, to have some basic understanding of it, because they have to make decisions about sharing their data, and they have to decide whether or not to purchase a Polar app, for instance. So that brings us to the next slide, which is about the phenomenon called the privacy paradox. I included a drawing here of an artist that has been fascinating me since I was a little kid. He's called MC Escher. It's a Dutch artist, and he draws very paradoxical drawings. And the phenomenon of the privacy paradox has been fascinating me as well since I started learning about privacy. And this is the phenomenon where people constantly say that they value privacy, they find it important. Yet, study after study, it's shown that people share way more data than you would expect based on how they value privacy. So studies generally go a little something like this. First, you ask people how important they think privacy is. Then you give them some assignment to, for instance, make a fake purchase in an experimental shopping environment. And voila, you see that people share way more data than you would expect based on the first. So I'm very interested in how it is that this privacy paradox exists. How come that people constantly share way more data than I know they would if they really would understand what they are doing? So partly I think that is because privacy is actually pretty complex and flexible and vague. But that's not all, because I think in the offline world, in real life, people have much better understanding of privacy and also know much better in which context to share which information. For example, if you go to the doctor, it's perfectly normal to, I don't know, take off your trousers if you have an ailment on your upper leg. So showing something very personal in this context, in this case, is actually completely normal and completely acceptable, even if you never saw the doctor before. And this holds even for people who really, really care about privacy. So this brings me to the definition I promised I would give you, which is to see privacy as contextual integrity. And this has been theorized by a US scholar called Helen Nissenbaum. And it's actually very intuitive. It's not too complex, even though it may look so at first sight. So let's start with a couple of basic assumptions that this theory is based on. And these assumptions are about humans and society. So first of all, Helen Nissenbaum argues that society is built on appropriate information flows. We are social beings, we are humans, we constantly share personal information, whether we like it or not. And actually, this is a good thing. This is just the way we as humans interact with each other and build our society. So this is sort of different than some people see privacy as secrecy, which would mean no information, or at least no personal information would flow from one place to the other. So this is the same as the control argument. In the privacy as secrecy, you should decide that you reveal something about yourself, but in our societies, this is nearly impossible, because even now I'm sharing personal information about myself because you can all see me. And if I would not want that, I could turn off my camera, but that's not really nice for this webinar, of course. So we constantly share personal information with each other, and this is what our societies are built on. That's the first assumption. Of course, the devil is in the details, so the question is, what then is considered appropriate? Well, the appropriateness of an information flow is decided by what Herr Nissenbaum calls context-specific norms. And this also implies that a one-size-fits-all definition of privacy is probably impossible, because what is considered appropriate in one context, or what is considered sensitive data in another context, may be something completely different in a whole new context. So two words stand out in this sentence, which is, of course, context and norms. Let's start with norms, because a norm in this respect is a prescription of someone, of how someone ought to behave. So take, for example, socially acceptable behavior. That's an example of an unwritten norm. If you meet someone new, it's usually socially acceptable to shake hands, of course, once COVID is gone. And everyone knows this, even though it's never been written down somewhere in what law whatsoever. Of course, norms can also be written down in laws. We will get to that in a bit. The other word would be context, or context specific. And this basically means that those norms, so how someone ought to behave, varies across different contexts. Again, suppose that you go to the doctor. It's very normal to tell them all sorts of intimate details, if it helps you get better. But it's very weird to tell the same details at a birthday party of your neighbors, for instance, where you just met new people. So these are two completely different contexts, but the information that you would share is the same. But we all know that in one context it's perfectly normal, and in the other it's not. So a privacy violation actually happens when one of those norms are breached. Well, how do we know that? That's because every information flow consists of these 5 parameters. So an information flow has a sender, someone or something, which acts as the source of the information flow. Of course, it also has a recipient, someone or something receiving the information on the other end. Then there's an information type. Information type or attribute would be what kind of information would be shared, such as your medical records or your home address, your photo database, all such kind of stuff. Of course, there's also a subject, so someone the information is about. And last but not least, there's the transmission principle, which is under which conditions will the data be shared. Let me give you an example to clarify, again, from the doctor. Other than the socially unwritten acceptable norms that the doctor does not share your intimate details with other people, we also have something written down in laws, which is called professional secrecy. So a doctor is legally protected in most countries, as far as I know, to not having to share information about his patients with authorities, for instance. So this would be a transmission principle. If you are willing to share your intimate details with the doctor because you know that the doctor will adhere to his professional secrecy. So let's try to make it more concrete by filling it in for an example I'm using across my presentation, the fitness app called Polar. So let's start with the sender. In the case of Polar, the sender can be your smartphone. If the app is installed on your smartphone, it can be your smartwatch or another device with sensor, or it can be the company Polar itself. The company Polar can also be the recipient of the information, but also the sender, of course, once they have it. But other recipients that you typically find are the law enforcement agencies, the government, Facebook, data brokers, advertisement companies, etc. Then the information type. In the case of Polar, this would be your running routes, your activity data, where you live, your occupation, your income, your gender, skin color, etc. All those information that Polar is probably gathering to help you become more fit. The subject in this case would be you, the fitness app user, and the transmission principle can be either of these. For instance, because you gave consent, or because someone has a warrant, or because you shared it in confidence, which means that the other person will not tell anyone else, or because you shared it such that Polar can earn money from it to keep the app free. So what you can do now with this theory, once you have found out all these parameters, is you can generate information flows. So let's do that just as an example once. So let's take Polar as a sender of the information. Let's take data brokers as recipients. Let's take all these data as information types. Well, there's only one subject. And let's take to earn money as a transmission principle. What you then get is the information flow is Polar is sending your activity data and such to data brokers, and it's about you, and they do that to earn money. And what can you do with this? Well, think for yourself for a little bit. Do you find this acceptable or not? And if we ask enough people, maybe Polar can have a sense of whether they should do this, or whether they should change one of these parameters to make it more acceptable. So this was a lot of information, and this is the end of part 2. I hope I've given you a little bit of insight into the complexity of defining privacy, but also how contextual integrity, which to me feels very intuitive, can actually help you see privacy in a new and usable way. For the next part, I would like to quickly discuss the GDPR for non-legal experts. I'm actually a non-legal person as well, so this is definitely not legal advice, so don't take it as such. I'm just doing my best attempt to give a simple explanation of the GDPR, which is usable for anyone. So let's start with a couple of misconceptions about the GDPR that I've been running into a lot. The first misconception would be that the GDPR intends to limit data processing. This is not true. The goal of the GDPR is actually to make data processing and sharing possible with the proper safeguards. So the law was not made to limit data processing, but to actually make it possible with the under the right conditions. The second misconception is that the GDPR is complicated. It's really not. Of course, if you're going to read the actual text, you would run into a lot of legalese, which is a specific type of language that legal people use, which might be complicated, but the basic concepts are actually quite simple and also intuitive, and I will show you in the next slide. A third misconception would be that the GDPR contains new rules and obligations. This is also not true. Before the GDPR, there were data protection laws across every country in Europe already active, and there's not much of a difference between those and the GDPR. The only biggest difference is that the GDPR is the same for every EU member state. So previously, each EU member state had their own data protection law, which was more or less similar. Now everyone has to abide by the GDPR. The fourth misconception would be that the GDPR is about informed consent. This is also not true. There are actually 6 legal grounds which allow you to process personal data, and consent is only one of them. So, and by the way, it's highly regulated. So actually consent is not always usable. So it's better to pick one of the other 5. The fifth one would be that the GDPR is not applicable to me or to these data because the data is encrypted. This is also not true. Even if it's encrypted and it contains personal data, it's still regarded as personal data, and you still have to abide by the GDPR. Of course, it's much better to have your data encrypted because whenever you get hacked, and it's encrypted data, the data subjects who the data is about will be much less harmed, of course. And the final misconception would be that the GDPR slows down economical growth because all the companies have to abide by the GDPR, and this will cost them a lot of money. But actually, there's a whole new market for very privacy-friendly services and apps. In general, it will definitely not slow down, but increase economical growth. So let's go to the key GDPR principles, which are listed here. I took this from the website of the UK Data Protection ICO. If you want to learn more about it, I would definitely recommend to read through it. It's very understandable. So let's start with the first one. The first key principle of the GDPR is that all data processing should be lawful, fair, and transparent, which means you should have good reasons to do so and be honest about it. So let's start with the first word, lawful. Like I said, there are 6 legal grounds for the processing of personal data. I will not mention them all, but consent is one we already saw. Another one was, for instance, that you have to make good on a contract. So there has to be one of those 6 legal grounds, otherwise you're not allowed to process personal data. So that's the first, it should be lawful. The second is that it should happen in a fair way, which means that you shouldn't purposely withhold information about what and why you're collecting data. In other words, your data subject or users should not be surprised if they found out how you are using their data. The third word is transparency, and this is inherently linked to fairness because transparency is about being clear, being open, and being honest with your users or data subjects about who you are, why you're processing their data, and what you're doing with it. So the second key principle of the GDPR is purpose limitation, which means that data should be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. So this means in practice that you can't collect data for a very broad set of purposes, such as we need this data to run the service. It's way too broad. And you also can simply repurpose data that you gathered for one purpose and use for another. So suppose that you send out newsletters to people and you ask them for their email address to send the newsletter to. It doesn't mean that once you already have the email address, you can also use it for other purposes, for instance, to sell them unsolicited advertisements. So the third principle is data minimization, which means that you can only collect data that you can only collect the minimum amount of data that you need to complete your purposes. So for example, again, the newsletter, if you want to gather subscribers for your newsletter, you can only ask the information necessary for you to send out those newsletters, which is usually an email address. You cannot ask for additional data such as phone numbers or home addresses because they're not directly related to that purpose. The fourth principle would be accuracy. And this means that you, if you are responsible for collecting personal data, are also responsible that the data is accurate. So you should set up checks and balances to correct, update, and erase data that is incomplete or incorrect. It also means that you have to do regular audits on the accuracy of the stored data. For example, if you have email addresses to contact users, you can check every year, does this email address still work? And are you still interested in receiving our newsletter? This would be an example of such an audit. The fifth principle would be storage limitation, which means that you can't store data indefinitely. You have to remove or anonymize data after a certain amount of time. It's not written down what this amount of time is. So this is something you will have to think about for yourselves, but I would say use your intuition. The sixth one would be integrity and confidentiality, which of course means that you have to keep your data secure, both from external threats, such as hackers with bad intentions, as internal threats, people without the right authorization having access to the data. If you fail to properly secure the data and you were hacked, for instance, it's possible that the data protection authority will fine you. So keep it secure. The seventh and last principle would be accountability, because of course you can say you are following all these rules without actually doing it. So there is some level of accountability required, and you must have appropriate measures and records in place to prove your compliance. The data protection authorities of each country can ask for evidence of your compliance if they choose to do so. So again, this was a lot, but I would summarize it as follows. Use your common sense. Specify what data you need, why you need it, what you're going to do with it, and make sure it's just those data and nothing else. In addition, properly secure it and be open and honest about it. Sounds like a piece of cake, right? So now that I have touched upon the essence of the GDPR, I have a couple of minutes left to talk about my own research, which is related to all the things I've just been telling you. We have a huge privacy problem. It's very complicated, privacy. The GDPR is a step in the right direction to regulate it, but we are still partly responsible for our own privacy decisions. So according to the GDPR, for instance, buying a polar fitness device is completely legal, even if you work for the military intelligence service. So we need something to help people understand the consequences of their own behavior. And this is where my own research comes in, because I believe part of the solution lies in the way we design devices and interfaces. But before we can get to that, we first have to look at how people actually make decisions. This is from a book by the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman. It's about how our brains are wired to take decisions every day. So we take thousands of decisions every day, and most of them are taken unconsciously by something that he calls system or type 1. This is a very intuitive part of our brain, which can take decisions really fast in an almost autonomous way. But the disadvantage is that it's also very biased, which I will show you in the next slide. Other than this fast system, we also have a type 2 system or system 2. This is a reflective system. This will require some working memory, some effort, but it's capable of abstract and hypothetical thinking. It's very conscious, and it allows you, for instance, to see situations from different angles. So this comes at a cost because it requires much more energy. Like I said, the first part of the brain is pretty biased. This is a complete list of known biases. I will definitely not go through them, but these biases can be seen as sort of shortcuts in your brain. Whenever you encounter a certain situation and you don't want to put in the effort to consider carefully what should be the next step, your system 1 can do that for you, but sometimes it takes a shortcut and it doesn't provide you with the best answer. A good example of this and kind of funny example would be the IKEA effect, which means that we attribute more value to things that we put in effort ourselves. So if you and your neighbors both have the same IKEA case, you will value your own much more than your neighbors because you put it together yourself. So knowing these cognitive biases, we see that companies actually use these to trick you into certain decisions that you would otherwise not take. And this brings us to something that you also may have heard of, and this is called dark patterns. Dark patterns are design patterns using one or more of those cognitive biases to trick you into choices that you would otherwise not make. And in this case, they would be beneficial to the service or the company offering the service. An example I included here is from Amazon. So they ask you to join Amazon Prime, which is something that has a monthly fee. And instead of just asking yes or no, they're using something called confirm shaming. They say, no, thanks, I don't want unlimited one-day delivery, which sort of guilts you into saying no. And apparently some people don't want to feel this guilt, so they click yes. There's also maybe a less harmful example from the men's toilets, the famous fly in the urinal. As long as you aim for the fly, you will not spray all over yourself, which is, of course, very handy that they included this. And this is what is known under the name of nudges. So nudges is actually the same trick. They use cognitive biases, but instead of it being in the best interest of the company behind it, these are supposedly in the best interest of yourself. However, I would argue that this difference, it's just two sides of the same coin. Because of this example, again, nudging is applied here to sort of move people to take the stair, to take the stairs instead of the escalator, because every stairway lists the amount of calories that you would burn if you take the stairs. However, suppose that you are disabled, you're in a wheelchair. If you see this, you will probably not be very happy about the fact that you cannot take the stairs and become healthy. So the last example is from a research paper I found about Facebook. A problem with Facebook is that people have no clue who is able to see what they share. And these researchers included a small design change where they listed the profile photos of your friends to make it very concrete who is able to see your posts. It sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? Well, the problem is, in my view, not necessarily what they choose to show, but what they choose not to show. Because even if you post something on Facebook completely privately, Facebook is still able to see what you've entered and still able to observe and infer certain data from that. And this is completely left out, of course, of this research. Let's take a closer look, because this is all about how design can influence us. So let's take a closer look at how this works. Actually, design can appeal to us in three different ways. The first one would be the visceral level. And these examples come from a book by Donald Norman, a design guru, and he uses teapots to make his point, because why not? So the first level would be the visceral level. And this is a teapot. Suppose that you need a new teapot. You walk into the teapot store, you see this teapot, and you immediately think, wow, this is a very nice looking teapot. I want to have it. This is a very visceral reaction. The second one would be the behavioral level. So suppose that you bought this teapot, but making tea in it takes way too much time. So you return to the store and you say to them, okay, it looks very nice, but I'm looking for a teapot that is very usable. This is the behavioral level. So this is where usability and functionality comes into play. These two levels are comparable to the system 1 and type 1 level of your brain I just mentioned before. But there is a third level, of course, the reflective level. And this is where design can also appeal to, as becomes clear from this photo, because this is a teapot that you would probably not buy to make tea in it, because every time you pour tea, you will burn yourself. But that doesn't mean that that you would not buy it, because if you think about it, this could actually be a very nice discussion piece. And maybe to translate it to a more realistic example, this is where human values come into play. So suppose that you are looking for a new bank. You can choose from 5 different banks, but only 2 of them have really sustainable goals. Even if their apps are less usable, even if their website looks much worse, you can still opt to go for that bank because you think sustainability is very important. Now, this is where my research comes in. I'm almost done, by the way, a couple of more minutes. This is where my research comes in, because I think in order to get to good privacy decisions, designers should appeal to our reflective level. And how do they do that? Well, they need a couple of things. And the first one would be what I call friction. Friction can be seen as deliberately slowing down the interaction, deliberately adding extra steps or extra clicks, or deliberately being vague and ambiguous about something. Because whenever we encounter such situations, we have more time to think about it, and we can put in more effort of our brains. So friction would be the first, but that's not all, because friction can be used to activate our reflective thinking. But during this process, it's very important that you explain to people, or you show to them, why the friction was being used. So what's behind the friction? And that's the goal of this phase. So designers should help people understand why the friction was being applied. And finally, if the goal of these first two circles would be to activate your reflective thinking and to consider a decision more carefully, of course, this is only useful if you also have the proper controls to do something about it. Well, let me clarify with just one example, and then I'm done. And this is from the smart speaker, the Google Home speaker, if I'm not mistaken. This is what it normally looks like. And there's an artist who made sort of an add-on to it. It's called Project Alias by Björn Karman. And this is actually a device that makes the Google Home, that gives you more control. Because what this device does is that you can train it with your own catchphrase. Normally, the device would only activate if you say, "Hey, Google," but with this device, you can train your own catchphrase, which gives you much more control and which also prevents people visiting your house from activating it unwantedly. Second, what this device does is that when you're not using the Google Home speaker, it actually physically turns the device off, because the Google Home device is literally always on, and it's therefore always listening and always hearing what's being said in the room, and always sending that information to the Google server whenever it thinks it's activated. So with this device, with this extra device, with this extra friction, you are allowed more control over the device, and it also gives you more time to actually think about the consequences of the speaker. I guess my time is up now, so I'll quickly stop talking and see if there are any questions. And thanks for listening, by the way.
Thank you very much, Arnout. I feel I've learned so much from your presentation, and there's so much that we can, that can be discovered. And very fascinating, the connection between the design aspect as well as the, the privacy protection. It's a very intriguing area. So well done. Thank you so much. I think there are probably a couple of questions already in the Q&A. Can you access it?
I can see it, yes.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Let me see.
Okay, so shall I start at the top? That was the question that was in the beginning.
Yes, yes. If you are, feel free to choose the questions to answer.
All right, so the question is, how do I know if my mobile phone has been hacked by clicking on a link? Very good question. I guess it depends on the hacking software that has been used, but I think in 99% of the cases you wouldn't know. Because that's the whole point of this hacking software. It's to sort of run in the background and to definitely not show itself to people. So I'm sorry, I'm afraid I can't answer the question, because I'm afraid you wouldn't know. So don't click on highly suspicious links. That's the only advice I can give in this case. The second question is, are apps still able to track mobile location if one turns off the location option for the mobile? Yes, I think so. I remember reading about this in the news somewhere, that especially Android phones, even when you shut down all the location sharing functions, Google still has some background process running where they sort of know your location. So yes, that's possible. And additional question, how can you stop other people from sharing your data, like contact details, on the web? Yeah, good question. I guess you can't. If you are in my contact list and I download an app which requires me to share my contacts, then you are in that as well. And there's nothing you can do about it. So there's no quick solution. I think the more long-term solution would be to make people aware of the consequences of sharing this information and hope that they will not do it again next time.
Anybody else with a question? I'd like to, if there's if there are no other questions, I just wanted to go over the concept of contextual integrity, and how obviously there is people who are users in general, probably even younger users, are unaware of the risk that they run in sharing all their precious data. And I think there must be some more awareness, campaigns in order to make them to raise the importance of this. And how do you think we could be done in this regard?
Yeah, I think awareness campaigns are very important. There's a funny video that I can share, but I have to look it up, where they did sort of a truth sayer. I think it's in Belgium somewhere. So they built up a tent on a public place, and they had a truth sayer supposedly sit there, and people walked into the tent, and this truth sayer suddenly knew all sorts of intimate details about this person, such as bank accounts, where they lived, etc. And of course, this was a very weird. And what then suddenly came to reveal, because in the other half of the tent, there were these hackers trying to figure out all the personal data of the people who entered the tent, and they were very successful. So this was a very sort of shocking way to be confronted with what you are sharing without you knowing. The disadvantage of awareness campaigns to me is that its effect is only temporary. And it's because you mentioned contextual integrity, it's completely out of context. So if you are going to the shopping mall and you see this truth sayer and you are confronted with what you are sharing, of course you are shocked, but then you come home again and you return to your normal life. I think it's very hard to translate your shock to actual improvements in your behavior. So yes, awareness campaigns are extremely important, but they are also the effect is usually also temporary, I think.
Probably frequency is also another matter. They have to be there and change and evolve continuously. Exactly. But I see that there is another question for you.
Yes. Okay. So I talked about Facebook having access to data in the private mode. Does it still store information if you delete the photos or other information? Very good question. I guess this is also something that we cannot really know for sure, because if Facebook says whenever you delete a photo, they will actually delete it, you would have to trust them to do so, because there's no way for you to check it. There is a way, by the way, and I think people have done this, and this is to submit a data access request. This is some of the data subject rights that you as a person has with GDPR, and people have done this. So they've submitted a data access request to Facebook, and they could see that Facebook still had stored photos of them that they deleted a long time ago.
Thank you very much. That's great. And I think we should share this with more people should know about this, in particular all the various Facebook users. And another question, and thanks for sharing that YouTube link.
Yeah, indeed. If the effect of awareness is temporarily, what would then be the best thing to do? Yeah, of course, that's the number one question. I don't claim to have the answer, but I think part of my research is exactly trying to solve that. So my research, specifically friction, reflection, and controls, is not only about raising awareness, but it's actually about changing the interaction in such a way that people encounter new patterns or encounter new unexpected things that sort of forces them to think what they are doing. Of course, I don't know what the long-term effects of this will be. This definitely has to be studied. But I think there is a big difference between an awareness campaign that is external, out of context, and an actual design change that is part of the interaction of the device that you are interacting with. And I hope the latter will provide more clarity and longer term effects, but that still remains to be studied.
Thank you so much. All these very good questions, and thanks a lot for your very good answers. So I think we are past, what time is it? Oh, it's past 4 o'clock, and oh, there is another one. Okay, no, so basically I wanted to remind you of the program, the Cybersecurity Month program, the Cyber Hero at Home, and also about the next 2 webinars that we have organized, and they will take place next the next 2 Thursdays in October at 3 o'clock CEST, 3 p.m. CEST. And the recording will be made available to all participants and in fact shared on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And you'll all receive a notification. And then if you want to do so, you will be able to share that with your colleagues or other people you think may find the content of our webinars interesting. So let me see, I see there is more on the chat. Okay, so the information that's been shared by Leonardo. And if there are not any more comments or questions, just many thanks again to Arnout. And that's a really fascinating field of research that you are covering there. And see you all next week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.